All right, we are live from Occupy City Hall in Rockford, Illinois. My name is Leslie Roth. I am a member of the May 30th Alliance. The May 30th Alliance is a direct action organization located in Rockford, Illinois, dedicated to the struggle to end police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice in Winnebago County. This is a segment that we call Rockford Reading. We have not conducted a Rockford Reading in 2 days. Last Rockford Reading we did was on Wednesday. Me and Friday, another member of the May 30th Alliance, read Rise of the Warrior Cop by Radley Balco. We began reading that. The book I've been reading by myself has been the Autobiography of Martin Luther King Jr. So we're going to pick up where we left off at, reading there. Again, we're trying to get to a place where we have where we got content coming out regularly regarding these issues. And so just like we began to do these weekly readings with Friday on Wednesdays, me and Antar have a weekly discussion we do on Thursdays that we were not able to conduct because the weather didn't permit this week. On Monday, me and Dinez will begin a weekly segment that we'll have as well. We're just going to get to a place where we slowly incorporate some type of a staple piece of content to be released every day in the week. As we get to the second year of our occupation, that's one of the things that we want to be putting an emphasis on, and that's consistency. So let's see how many of these chapters we can run through today. We're on Chapter 15, Atlanta Arrest and Presidential Politics. All right, give me a second. I'm going to take a drink of my coffee real quick. Share this video. Whatever platform you're watching it on, share this video, please. All right. All right, Chapter 15, Atlanta Arrest and Presidential Politics. My first contact with John Kennedy was when he was a senator seeking the nomination for president. For several months, we had tried to work out a meeting, and every time I could go, he was away. Finally, we worked out an engagement at his apartment in New York. That was June of 1960, about a month before the convention. We talked for about an hour over the breakfast table. I was very frank about what I thought, that there was a need for a strong executive leadership and that we hadn't gotten this during the Eisenhower administration. If we didn't get it in the new administration, we would be set back even more. I was very impressed by the forthright and honest manner in which he discussed the civil rights question, and with his concern and his willingness to learn more about civil rights. I specifically mentioned the need for an executive order outlawing discrimination in federally assisted housing. I also mentioned to him the need for strong civil rights legislation, and I stressed voting issues because we were deeply involved at that time in voter registration drives and had encountered a number of difficulties in states like Alabama and Mississippi. As I recall, he agreed with all of these things. He agreed that there was a need for strong executive leadership and that this had not existed, and he felt that if he received the nomination and was elected, he could give this kind of leadership. He assured me also that he felt the whole question of the right to vote was key and basic, and that this would be one of the immediate things that he would look into. He said that he had voted consistently for civil rights. I raised the question with him about 1957, when he voted against what we, at that time, considered as a very important section of the Civil Rights Bill. He said that since that time, if he had to face the issue again, he would reverse his position because many of the developments during the sit-in movement had pointed up the injustices and indignities that Negroes were facing all over the South, and for this reason, he had reevaluated many of these things. John Kennedy did not have the grasp and the comprehension of the depths of the problem at that time, as he later did. He knew that segregation was morally wrong, and he certainly intellectually committed himself to integration. But I could see that he didn't have the emotional involvement then. He had not really been involved enough in and with the problem. He didn't know too many Negroes personally. He had never really had the personal experience of knowing the deep groans and passionate yearnings of the Negro for freedom, because he just didn't know Negroes generally, and he hadn't had any experience in the civil rights struggle. So I felt that it was an intellectual commitment. And then what I want to point out there is that John Kennedy, Dr. King is speaking about how his interactions with John Kennedy, as he was seeking the nomination, as he interacted with him, he was judging his commitment to the issues of civil rights. And one of the things he used to as a marker of his commitment to the issues of civil rights was where John Kennedy had voted on one of these issues in the past. And John Kennedy had voted against a piece of legislation that black people at that time felt was important towards pushing the civil rights struggle and the civil rights movement forward, and John Kennedy voted against that. And when Dr. King brought that issue up to him, John Kennedy said that if he had to make that vote again, he would vote differently because of the sit-in movement bringing to light and bringing awareness and putting and shining and illuminating the indignities and the injustices that were going on in the South around these issues. And so again, we get to a place to speak about where we exist now in the struggle against police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice. There are people who think that they understand these issues or think that they know these issues or stand in a certain place on these issues, but it's because it's out of ignorance. It's out of naivete about these issues. It's because they don't have firsthand experience with these issues. It's because they don't have firsthand interaction with these issues. And so it becomes incumbent upon people who have had the experiences or who have had firsthand interactions or who are not ignorant, who are not naive about these issues, to be involved in demonstrations, to be involved in organizing, to be involved in mobilizing, to highlight the injustices that exist around these issues, the indignities that exist around these issues, and to inform people so that way the people who are ignorant can now become informed about the issue, and they can be in a place where they can have a change of mind. The people who are naive about an issue can become aware about an issue, and they can become in a place where they can change their mind. People who are sheltered from an issue must come, you force them to come face to face with the issue, and then they can change their minds. And so John Kennedy would have never been in a position to change his mind about some of these civil rights issues if it were not for the people in the sit-in movement highlighting the hypocrisies and highlighting the indignities and injustices that existed around segregation in the South. And so it's incumbent upon us to do the same things. There are plenty of people, whether they be in political offices or they're in private corporate business offices, who the reason that they are pro-police or pro-mass incarceration or even pro-racial injustice is because they don't understand the gravity of the issue. They don't understand the nature and the depths of the issues. And so it's our responsibility and duty as people who do know those things or who are beginning to know and learn those things to articulate out to people the truth about these manners. And part of that articulation is being involved and being in the streets and forcing these issues to be in the forefront. And again, like I said, this for anybody who may be watching this segment for the first time, or listening to this segment for the first time, however it's being broadcasted to you. We don't want to just be arbitrarily reading these pieces of literature. We don't just want to be arbitrarily reading this information. We want to be comprehending the information, being able to articulate the information, so that way we can put these things into practice and know why we're putting these things into practice. Back on page 144. A few months later, after he had been nominated, I talked with him over at his house in Georgetown, and in that short period, he had really learned a great deal about civil rights and had been advised rather well. I'd had little enthusiasm when he first announced his candidacy, but I had no doubt that he would do the right thing on the civil rights issue if he were elected president. He was very much concerned then about the election and possibly losing. Some of his friends were concerned about this and felt he had to do something dramatic to convince the nation of his commitment to civil rights. Some of the advisors thought that he should come south and make a civil rights speech in the South, which would really convince people. They wanted him to come under my auspices to speak for a board meeting or a dinner sponsored by SCLC. I told him I just could not do that unless Mr. Nixon came, because we were a nonpartisan organization. I said, quote, "Now Nixon may not come, but I would have to invite him," end quote. But they felt, naturally, that it wouldn't work that way. So I kind of backed out on that idea because I thought it would be a mistake. For many months during the election campaign, my close friends urged me to declare my support for John Kennedy. I spent many troubled hours searching for the responsible and fair decision. I was impressed by his qualities, by many elements in his record, and by his program. I had learned to enjoy and respect his charm and his incisive mind. But I made very clear to him that I did not endorse candidates publicly, and I could not come to the point that I would change my views on this. Nevertheless, I was grateful to Senator Kennedy for the genuine concern he expressed about my arrest in October 1960 because of my participation in nonviolent efforts to integrate lunch counters in Atlanta, Georgia. I took part in the lunch counter sit-ins at Rich's department store as a follower, not a leader. I did not initiate the thing. It came into being with the students discussing the issues involved. They called me and asked me to join in. They wanted me to be in it, and I felt a moral obligation to be in it with them. I was arrested along with some 280 students in a sit-in demonstration seeking to integrate lunch counters. I said when I went in Fulton County Jail that I could not, in all good conscience, post bail and that I would stay and serve the time, even if it was 1 year, 5, or 10 years. Of course, the students agreed to stay also. And this is an excerpt that I believe Dr. King either wrote to the judge or stated to the judge. If, by chance, Your Honor, we are guilty of violating the law, please be assured that we did it to bring the whole issue of racial injustice under the scrutiny of the conscience of Atlanta. I must honestly say that we firmly believe that segregation is evil and that our Southland will never reach its full potential and moral maturity until this cancerous disease is removed. We do not seek to remove this unjust system for ourselves alone, but for our white brothers as well. The festering sore of segregation debilitates the white man as well as the Negro. So if our actions in any way serve to bring this issue to the forefront of the conscience of the community, they were not undertaken in vain. And, sir, I know you have a legal obligation facing you at this hour. This judicial obligation may cause you to hand us over to another court rather than dismiss the charges. But, sir, I must say that I have a moral obligation facing me at this hour. This imperative drives me to say that if you find it necessary to set a bond, I cannot in all good conscience have anyone go buy my bail. I will choose jail rather than bail, even if it means remaining in jail a year or even 10 years. Maybe it will take this type of self-suffering on the part of numerous Negroes to finally expose the moral defense of our white brothers who happen to be misguided and thusly awaken the dozing conscience of our community. And what I want to point out from this excerpt is, what up? What I want to point out from this excerpt is when Dr. King says, we do not seek to remove this unjust system for ourselves alone, but for our white brothers as well. The festering sore of segregation debilitates the white man as well as the Negro. And I once heard, and to correlate this back to the struggle to end police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice, we want to be able to read ideologies and tactics and beliefs and events that have happened in the past and then be able to transfer them over to the events that are happening presently. But I once spoke to somebody, and they spoke about how the same way that a person who is in jail is dehumanized by the conditions inside the jail, is dehumanized by being in prison, dehumanized by being told, by having the bathroom inside of the cell and somebody else using the bathroom with them, dehumanized by the way that they are treated by correctional officers and the way that they are, how they become a number, how they just become a piece of a system. So are the people that are doing the dehumanizing. The people who are doing the dehumanizing are also dehumanizing themselves in a way, are barbarizing themselves in a way, because you cannot objectify a person and turn a person into a thing and dehumanize a person regularly and habitually without it also having an effect on you as well. And the same thing goes for police officers. These police officers who have murdered the people who are on these poles, these police officers who have shot down people in these streets, these police officers are not mentally well, mentally healthy. These police officers, these same actions that they do to terrorize our communities has the effect of barbarizing them. The same actions that they do of trying to dehumanize our community has the same actions of dehumanizing them. And so it's not only one side of this coin that these issues have to be eradicated for. There's two sides of this coin that these issues have to be eradicated for. And so when I hear Dr. King speak about how the issue of segregation does not only do something that is inherently negative to the person being segregated against, it also does something that is inherently negative to the person doing the segregating. It also makes me think of how Dr. King pointed out one of his speeches, how in the English dictionary, under the word white, there was 120 synonyms, and all the 120 synonyms were positive. That they were synonyms like pure as snow, and innocent. And when you look at the definition for black, that the synonyms were primarily negative. Things like black as night or black as sin. And he said that what that does is it gives, for white students and for white kids, it gives them 120 ways of having a false superiority complex. And then for black children, it gives them 60 ways of having a false inferiority complex. And I think that, again, we have to look at these injustices and these indignities from both perspectives. That, yes, they do a humongous job of disservicing the people that they are done to, but it also does a job of disservicing the people who are enacting them and who are doing them. Okay, we're back on page 145. When they came to see after 5 or 6 days that we were not coming out and that the community was getting very much concerned, the merchants dropped the charges, which meant that everybody was released without bail immediately. But when I was released, they served me with papers stating that I had violated my probation and that I would be transferred to DeKalb jail and go on trial in court there. On the night of May 4th, 1960, police had stopped me in DeKalb County and discovered I still had an Alabama's driver's license. Because of this, they gave me a ticket. I had gone to court, and I didn't even know at the time, but the lawyer pleaded guilty for me, and they had fined me something like $25 or $50 and placed me on probation for, I guess, 6 months. It was such a minor case. I didn't pay attention to it and never knew that the lawyer had pleaded guilty. He had just told me, quote, "I've got everything worked out," end quote. He made me think it was clear and all I needed to do was pay. Actually, they later admitted in court that they had never fined or arrested anybody on a charge like that, and they really had nothing on the statute to reveal how long you had to be in Atlanta before changing your license. So it was obviously a case of persecution. I sat in the back of the courtroom while Mr. Charles M. Clayton, a Negro attorney who represented me, talked with the judge. We had this big trial, and I had my lawyers arguing the case brilliantly, and after all of that, the judge said 6 months of hard labor, and this was not appealable. So they took me back upstairs and put me in jail in the DeKalb County Jail. Then early in the morning, about 3 o'clock in the morning, they came and got me and took me to Reedsville. That was the state prison some 220 miles from Atlanta. On the way, they dealt with me just like I was some hardened criminal. They had me chained all the way down to my legs, and they tied my legs to something in the floor so there would be no way to escape. They talked with themselves. It was a long ride. I didn't know where they were taking me, but finally I assumed it must be to one of the state prisons after we had been going so long. That kind of mental anguish is worse than dying, riding for mile after mile, hungry and thirsty, bound and helpless, waiting and not knowing what you're waiting for, and all over a traffic violation. And so, again, one of the things that, hold on real quick. When we talk about police terrorism, one of the parts that I think is important to point out, and the reason that I think terrorism is the most appropriate word to attach to it, is that it's not always necessarily something that is violent in nature that happens, or even something that is necessarily brutal in nature that happens. Dr. King in this car ride is having this is psychological effects that are happening to him, which sort of speaks more to the action of terrorizing. It's not always that everybody who has these interactions with police officers and with police departments and the institution of policing deals with something that is violent or deals with something that is brutal, but there's still a psychological element to it that feeds into the concept of terrorizing and being terrorized. And so this whole car ride over, he wasn't being beat, he wasn't being pepper sprayed or being tased, but he was being terrorized because he didn't know where he was going to. He wasn't being given any information. He had been shackled and chained up, and that's his own violence in a way as well. But again, I just think that, and then this is dating back to, we're in 1961, I believe. And so you see how regularly these methods and these tactics have been used. And again, this is all for a traffic violation, a traffic ticket. And that goes to the point that, you know, I'm not sure how many people are watching the different readings, but in the book, The Rise of the Warrior Cop, in the very beginning of this book, one of the things Radley Balco states is that since the inception of policing, and since the inception of the concept of policing, the number one motive for it has been to maintain a social order. The number one motive for it has been to maintain control over the masses of people and over communities of people, not to protect and serve. And we see how that is being implemented here, and how it has been implemented year after year for Dr. King, where instead of trying, it's not that Dr. King is putting the community in danger, or they're trying to protect him because there's some crimes that have victims in it. They are trying to protect somebody from him because of crimes that people were victims or victimized. This is all in an effort to maintain status quo and maintain the social order that existed in the South. When people found out that they had taken me out in the wee hours of the morning and transferred me, there was a real resentment all over. I think people had already started talking to both Nixon and Kennedy about doing something even when we were still in the Fulton County Jail, saying to them that they should make a statement about it. After they transferred me to Reedsville, in a segregated cell block, a place where inmates who had attacked guards, psychotics, and other special cases were housed, Harris Wofford and others strongly urged Mr. Kennedy to try to use his influence to do something about it, and he finally agreed. The first thing he did was call my wife. She was pregnant, and this was a kind of rough experience for her. So he called her and expressed his concern. He said that he would do whatever he could and that he would think this over with his brother and try to use his influence to get me released. In the meantime, Robert Kennedy called the judge to find out about the bond. I understand Robert Kennedy was really angry about it when they let him know all the facts of the situation. In that spirit of anger, he called the judge. I don't know what he said in that conversation with the judge, but it was later revealed his main point was, quote, "Why can't he be bonded out?" end quote. I was released the next day. It was about 2 weeks before the election. Senator Kennedy had served as a great force in making my release from Reedsville prison possible. I was personally obligated to him and his brother for their intervention during my imprisonment. He did it because of his great concern and his humanitarian bent. I would like to feel that he made the call because he was concerned. He had come to know me as a person then. He had been in the debates and had done a good job when he talked about civil rights and what the Negro faces. Harris and others had really been talking with him about it. At the same time, I think he naturally had political considerations in mind. He was running for an office, and he needed to be elected, and I'm sure he felt the need for the Negro votes. So I think that he did something that expressed deep moral concern, but at the same time, it was politically sound. It did take a little courage to do this. He didn't know it was politically sound. I always felt that Nixon lost the real opportunity to express support of something much larger than an individual because this expressed support for the movement of civil rights. It indicated the direction that this man would take, It indicated the direction that this man would take if he became president. And I had known Nixon longer. He had been supposedly close to me, and he would call me frequently about things, seeking my advice. And yet, when this moment came, it was like he had never heard of me. So this is why I really considered him a moral coward and one who was unwilling to take a courageous step and take a risk. and I am convinced that he lost the election because of that. Many Negroes were still on the fence, still undecided, and they were leaning toward Nixon. Dr. King has these like letters that are inserted in this autobiography that I did not go through and read, but I do want to read this one about Richard Nixon because this gets us to, in my opinion, some of the beginning stages of mass incarceration. Starts with Nixon, and some of the beginning stages of the altering of the altering of policing in this country begin with Nixon. I believe Nixon was the first person to use the term war on drugs. And so I just want to read what Dr. King said about Richard Nixon. First, I must admit that I was strongly opposed to Vice President Nixon before meeting him personally. I went to him with an initial bias. I remembered his statements against Helen, Gagin, Douglas, and also the fact that he voted with the right wing of the Republican Party. These were almost unforgivable sins for me at that time. After meeting the vice president, however, I must admit that my impression somewhat changed. I have frankly come to feel that the position and the world contacts of the vice president have matured his person and judgment. Whether he can have experienced a complete conversion, I cannot say. But I do believe that he has grown a great deal and has changed many of his former opinions. Since I am quite interested in civil rights, I might say just a word concerning his views at this point. I am coming to believe that Nixon is absolutely sincere about his views on this issue. His travels have revealed to him how the race problem is hurting America in international relations, and it is altogether possible that he has no basic real prejudice. Nixon happens to be a Quaker, and there are very few Quakers who are prejudiced from a racial point of view. I also feel that Nixon would have done much more to meet the present crisis in race relations than President Eisenhower has done. Finally, I would say that Nixon has a genius for convincing one that he is sincere. When you are close to Nixon, he almost disarms you with his apparent sincerity. You never get the impression that he is the same man who campaigned in California a few years ago and who made a tear-jerking speech on television in the 1952 campaign to save himself from an obnoxious misdeed. And so, I will conclude by saying that if Richard Nixon is not sincere, he is the most dangerous man in America. This was written in September 2nd, 1958. And that last sentence there is the sentence that I think is the most poignant. And so I will conclude by saying that if Richard Nixon is not sincere, he is the most dangerous man in America. And we're not going to take time right now to dive into all the corruption and injustices and misdeeds of Richard Nixon. But I find it very prophetic that in 1958, 10 years before Richard Nixon would be elected president, in 1968, Dr. King was forewarning us of the things that would come along with Richard Nixon and the type of man he was. And this country was forever shifted by some of the malicious policies of Richard Nixon and the racist policies of Richard Nixon. All right, let's continue. My father had endorsed Nixon until that call. He knew about my relations with Nixon, and I think he felt that Nixon would do a good job on the civil rights question. I guess deep down within there may have been a little of the religious feeling that a Catholic should not be president. I'm sure my father had been somewhat influenced by this, so that he had not gone on record endorsing Nixon. What up? So that he had gone on record endorsing Nixon. After that call, however, he changed and he made a very strong statement. I was grateful to Senator Kennedy for the genuine concern he expressed in my arrest. After the call, I made a statement to the press thanking him but not endorsing him. Very frankly, I did not feel at that time that there was much difference between Kennedy and Nixon. I could find some things in the background of both men that I did not particularly agree with. Remembering what Nixon had done out in California to Helen, Gagin, Douglas, I felt that he was an opportunist at many times who had no real grounding in basic convictions, and his voting record was not good. He improved when he became vice president, but when he was a congressman and a senator, he didn't have a good voting record. With Mr. Kennedy, after I looked over his voting record, I felt at points that he was so concerned about being president of the United States that he would compromise basic principles to become president. But I had to look at something else beyond a man, the people who surrounded him. And I felt that Kennedy was surrounded by better people. It was on this basis that I felt that Kennedy would make the best president. I never came out with an endorsement. My father did, but I never made one. I took this position in order to maintain a nonpartisan posture, which I have followed all along in order to be able to look objectively at both parties at all times. As I said to him all along, I couldn't, and I never changed at that, even after he made the call during my arrest. I made a statement of thanks, and I expressed my gratitude for the call, but in the statement I made it clear that I did not endorse any candidate and that this was not to be interpreted as an endorsement. I had to conclude that the then known facts about Kennedy were not adequate to make an unqualified judgment in his favor. I do feel that, as any man, he grew a great deal. After he became president, I thought we really saw two Kennedys, a Kennedy of the first 2 years and another Kennedy emerging in 1963. He was getting ready to throw off political considerations and see the real moral issues. Had President Kennedy lived, I would probably have endorsed him in 1964. But back at that time, I concluded that there was something to be desired in both candidates. All right, that brings us to the end of chapter 15. It gets us on chapter 16, which is entitled The Albany Movement. I'm not sure how many people know about the movement that was took place in Albany, Georgia. But it was one that Dr. King credits for being instrumental in preparing him for the movement that is more popularized in mainstream America, which is the movement in Selma. And a lot of things that Dr. King speaks about, a lot of things that people considered failures about the movement in Selma, a lot of things that people consider failures about the movement in Albany, Dr. King says he sees as successes because they allowed him to prepare for the movement that they would have in Selma. So let's start diving into that. Chapter 16, again, we're reading Autobiography of Martin Luther King Jr. If you're watching this, go ahead and share this live for me. Then we got another chapter in us. Oh, this is a long chapter. Is it? Oh yeah, this is a long chapter. Yeah, we ain't gonna get through this chapter in this sitting, but we gonna knock out what we can though. Oh shit. Okay. All right. Page 152, the Autobiography of Martin Luther King Jr. In 1961, the Kennedy administration waged an essentially cautious and defensive struggle for civil rights against an unyielding adversary. As the year unfolded, executive initiative became increasingly feeble, and a chilling prospect emerged of a general administration retreat. Negroes had manifested their faith by racking up a substantial majority of their votes for President Kennedy. They had expected more of him than of the previous administration. His administration appeared to believe it was doing as much as was politically possible and had, by its positive deeds, earned enough credit to coast on civil rights. Politically, perhaps, this was not a surprising conclusion. How many people understood during the first 2 years of the Kennedy administration that the Negroes, quote, now, end quote, was becoming as militant as the segregationists, quote, never, end quote. Despite tormenting handicaps, Negroes moved from sporadic, limited actions to broad-scale activities different in kind and degree from anything done in the past. A new spirit was manifest in the Negro's willingness to demonstrate in the streets of communities in which, by tradition, he was supposed to step aside when a white man strode toward him. Areas such as Mississippi and rural Georgia, hitherto quiescent, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, were churned into turbulence by registration campaigns and freedom rides. The change in spirit was even more dramatically exemplified by the Negro's willingness in communities such as Albany to endure mass jailing. Albany, Georgia was a distillation of the tensions and conflicts straining the social fabric of the contemporary South. On one side were the segregationists who thought granted stubbornness was a policy. On the other side were Negroes marching forward utilizing nonviolence. Discrimination of all kinds have been simultaneously brought under our sights. School segregation, denial of voting rights, segregation in parks, libraries, restaurants, and buses. The Negroes of Albany suffered in silence. The throbbing pain of segregation could be felt but not seen. It scarred Negroes in every experience of their lives. They lived in segregation, they ate in segregation, they learned in segregation, They prayed and rode to work together in segregation. And in silence, a courting loss of self-respect rusted their moral fiber. Their discontent was turned inward on themselves, but an end came with the beginning of protest. And then I want to point out there that another one of the things that's important to note is this is something that happens regularly in communities, in societies, where and we see it happening currently now with the issue of police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice. When outside institutions or outside institutions are implementing injustices into a community, majority of times the community does not have the power to struggle against this outside institution. And so what happens is they turn that anger and that frustration inward. They begin to since they can't have a physical confrontation with the police officer that just assaulted them, they may end up having a physical confrontation with somebody at a bar or somebody at a house party, or because of the trauma that they deal with from being inside of a prison or from being inside of a jail. It's fucking beast. That trauma, instead of it, since they can't release it on a correctional officer, they can't release it on the institution of the jail, they come out and they release that onto members of the community, onto people in the community. And again, this is, I'm sort of having a surface level conversation about something that needs to be spoken about at a deeper, more complex level. But again, the same type of things that happen with segregation, where black people would have to move out the way for a white person on the sidewalk, or a black person would be called boy all day, or be called nigger all day, or have to say sir to somebody that they were older than. It would build up this frustration and this anger internally inside of black people, and they would in turn a lot of times let those things out inside of their own community because they felt that they couldn't let those things out outside of the community. You begin to develop a self-hatred for who you are because of the things you have to deal with because of who you are, and then you hate people who look like you, who remind you of who you are. And this has happened for generation after generation in our communities, and this is something that is very prevalent here. And so we have to understand the roots of these issues so that way we can get to a place of absolving ourselves of these issues. And self-hatred is definitely one of the things that we have to contend with. Police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice breed self-hatred. Same way as segregation did. As Rosa Parks triggered the Montgomery bus protests, so the arrival in December 1961 of 11 Freedom Riders had triggered the now historic nonviolent thrust in Albany. This Freedom Ride movement came into being to reveal the indignities of the injustices which Negro people faced as they attempted to do the simple things of traveling through the South as interstate passenger. As they attempted to do the simple thing of traveling through the South as interstate passengers. The Freedom Rides, which were begun by the young, grew to such proportion that they eventually encompassed people of all ages. As a result of this movement, many achievements had come into being. The Interstate Commerce Commission has said in substance that all bus terminals must be integrated. The dramatic Albany movement was the climax to this psychological forward thrust. The Albany movement, headed by Dr. W.G. Anderson, was already functional and had developed a year-long history on the part of the Negro community to seek relief of their grievances. The presence of staff and personnel of variegated human relations fields gave rise to the notion that Albany had been made a target city, with the ominous decision having been made months before, probably in a, quote, smoke-filled New York hotel room, end quote. The truth is, Albany had become a symbol of segregation's last stand almost by chance. The ferment of 100 years of frustration had come to the fore. Sociologically, Albany had all the ingredients of a target city, but it could just as easily been one of 100 cities throughout the deep and mid-South. 27,000 Negroes lived in Albany, Georgia, but 100 years of political, Economic and educational suppression had kept them helplessly enslaved to a demonic, though sophisticated, system of segregation which sought desperately and ruthlessly to perpetuate these deprivations. Negroes, wielding nonviolent protest in its most creative utilization to date, challenged discrimination in public places, denial of voting rights, school segregation, and the deprivation of free speech and assembly. On that broad front, the Albany movement used all the methods of nonviolence: direct action expressed through mass demonstrations, jail-ins, sit-ins, wade-ins, and kneel-ins, political actions, boycott, and legal actions. In no other city of the Deep South had all these methods of nonviolence been simultaneously exercised. And so, I think, one second. Oh shit, damn. And so, I think what I want to point out there is, again, all the different methods and tactics that Dr. King just spoke about, and these are all different methods and tactics that are still relevant to where we currently sit with the issues of police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice. But we have to build a political consciousness. We have to bring up a generation and bring up a group of people who will be willing to sacrifice and struggle in these methods, in these manners, because they understand that results will be yielded from it. And as was pointed out here, is Dr. King talks about before they got involved, the SCLC in this movement in Albany, it had been going on for a year already, and that the issues that had existed for over 100 years, and before that had been on the back burner of the society, and now because of these demonstrations, because of the militancy of the movement, they were being pushed to the forefront of the consciousness of the society. The city authorities were wrestling with slippery contradictions, seeking to extend municipal growth and expansion while preserving customs suitable only in a backward and semi-feudal society. Confronted by the potency of the nonviolent protest movement, the city fathers sought to project an image of unyielding mastery. But in truth, they staggered from blunder to blunder, losing their cocksureness and common sense as they built retaining walls of slippery sand to shore up a crumbling edifice of injustice. I'm going to try that one more time. But in truth, they staggered from blunder to blunder, losing their cocksureness and common sense as they built retaining walls of slippery sand to shore up a crumbling edifice of injustice. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference gave full moral and financial support to the Albany movement and the noble efforts of that community to realize justice, equal rights, and an end to second-class citizenship. For us, the first stage of victory required that Negroes break the barrier of silence and paralysis which for decades suppressed them and denied them the simplest forms of improvement. This victory was achieved when nonviolent protest aroused every element of the community: the youth, the elderly, men and women in the tens of thousands. Class distinctions were erased in the streets and in jail as domestics, professionals, workers, businessmen, teachers, and laundresses were united as cellmates, charged together with the crime of seeking human justice. On December 16, 1961, the Negro community of that city made a stride toward freedom. Citizens from every quarter of the community made their moral witness against the system of segregation. They willingly went to jail to create an effective protest. I too was jailed on charges of parading without a permit, disturbing the peace, and obstructing the sidewalk. I refused to pay the fine and had expected to spend Christmas in jail. I hoped thousands would join me. I didn't come to be arrested. I had planned to stay a day or so and return home after giving counsel. But after seeing negotiations break down, I knew I had to stay. My personal reason for being in Albany was to express a personal witness to a situation I felt was very important to me. As I, accompanied by over 100 spirited Negroes, voluntarily chose jail to bail, the city officials appeared to so harden to all appeals to conscience that the confidence of some of our supporters was shaken. They nervously counted heads and concluded too hastily that the movement was losing momentum. I shall never forget the experience of seeing women over 70, teenagers, and middle-aged adults, some with professional degrees in medicine, law, and education, some simple housekeepers and laundresses, crowding the cells. This development was an indication that the Negro would not rest until all the barriers of segregation were broken down. The South had to decide whether it would comply with the law of the land or drift into chaos and social stagnation. One must search for words in an attempt to describe the spirit of enthusiasm and majesty engendered in the next mass meeting on that night when 700 Negro citizens were finally released from prison. Out from the jails came those men and women, doctors, ministers, housewives, all of whom had joined ranks with the gallant student leadership in an exemplary demonstration of nonviolent resistance to segregation. Before long, the merchants were urging a settlement upon the city officials, and an agreement was finally wrung from their unwilling hands. That agreement was dishonored and violated by the city. It was inevitable that the sweep of events would see a resumption of the nonviolent movement, and when cases against the 700-odd prisoners were not dropped, and when the city council refused to negotiate to end discrimination in public places, actions began again. When the Albany movement, true to its promise, resumed protest activity in July 1962, it invited the Southern Christian Leadership Conference to share leadership with it. As president of the SCLC, I marshaled our staff of personnel experienced in nonviolent action, voter registration, and law. Ralph and I have been called to trial along with 2 other Albany citizens in February. Recorder's Court Judge A.N. Durden deferred judgment until Tuesday, July 10th. Okay, this is an excerpt from the Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s diary in jail. Excuse me, y'all, my fault. Tuesday, July 10th. We left Atlanta in a party of 7 via Southern Airlines to attend court trial in Albany, Georgia. The party included Juanita and Ralph Abernathy, Wyatt Walker, Ted Brown, Vincent Harding, Coretta, and myself. We left Atlanta around 7:45 a.m. and arrived in Albany promptly at 8:50 a.m. Promptly at 8:50. We were met at the airport by Andy Young, who had preceded us the night before, Dr. William Anderson, and the 2 detectives who had been assigned to us by the city. Dr. Anderson brought us up to date on the temper of the Negro community. He assured us that the people were generally enthusiastic and determined to stick with us to the end. He mentioned that several people had made it palpably clear that they would go to jail again and stay indefinitely. From all of these words, we gradually concluded that we had no alternative but to serve the time if we were sentenced. Sorry about that. Considering church and organizational responsibilities, we concluded that we could not stay in more than 3 months. But if the sentence were 3 months or less, we would serve the time. With this decision, we left for court. At 10 o'clock a.m., Judge Durden called the court to order. He immediately began by reading a prepared statement. It said in short that he had found all 4 defendants guilty. The 4 defendants were Ralph Abernathy, Eddie Jackson, Solomon Walker, and myself. Ralph and I were given a fine of $178 or 45 days on the streets. Jackson and Walker were given lesser fines and days since, according to the judge, they were not the leaders. Ralph and I immediately notified the court that we could not in all good conscience pay the fine and thereby chose to serve the time. Eddie Jackson joined us in this decision. Mr. Walker decided to appeal. After a brief press conference in the vestibule of the court, we were brought immediately to the Albany City Jail, which is in the basement of the same building which houses the court and City Hall. This jail is by far the worst I've ever been in. It is a dingy, dirty hole with nothing suggestive of civilized society. The cells are saturated with filth and what mattresses there are for the bunks are as hard as solid rocks and as nasty as anything that anyone has ever seen. The companionship of roaches and ants is not at all unusual. In several of the cells, that's right! In several of the cells, there are no mattresses at all. The occupants are compelled to sleep on the bare, hard steel. When we entered our cell, Ralph and I were placed together in a single cell. We found it as filthy as all the rest. However, conscious of the fact that he has some political prisoners on hand who could make these conditions known around the nation, the chief immediately ordered the entire cell block to be cleaned. So with water, soap, and Lysol, the boys got to work and gave it the cleaning it so desperately needed. The rest of the day was spent getting adjusted to our home for the next 45 days. There is something inherently depressing about jail, especially when one is confined to a cell. We soon discovered that we would not be ordered to work on the streets because, according to the chief, quote, it would not be safe, end quote. This, to me, was bad news. I wanted to work on the streets at least to give some attention to the daily round. Jail is depressing because it shuts off the world. It leaves one caught in the dull monotony of sameness. It is almost like being dead while one still lives. To adjust to such a meaningless existence is not easy. The only way that I adjust to it is constantly reminding myself that this self-imposed suffering is for a great cause and purpose. This realization takes a little of the agony and a little of the depression away. But in spite of this, the painfulness of the experience remains. It is something like the mother giving birth to a child. While she is temporarily consoled by the fact that her pain is not just bare, meaningless pain, she nevertheless experiences the pain. In spite of the fact that she realizes that beneath her pain is the emergence of life in a radiant infant, she experiences the agony right on. So is the jail experience. It is life without the singing of a bird, without the sight of the sun, moon, and stars, without the felt presence of fresh air. In short, it is life without the beauties of life. It is bare existence, cold, cruel, and degenerating. One of the things that takes the monotony out of jail is the visit of a relative or a friend. About 1:30, 3 hours after we were arrested, our wives came by to see us. As usual, Coretta was calm and sweet, encouraging me at every point. God blessed me with a great and wonderful wife. Hold on 1 second. These batteries getting low. All right, there we go. It's my second time reading this. I enjoyed this book very much. Every issue that we are addressing, police terrorism, mass incarceration, racial injustice, Dr. King speaks about in an eloquent manner, in a very poetic manner at times. And some of these issues, like mass incarceration, hadn't even come to full fruition yet. But hold on, let me finish through this, and then we'll talk about the excerpt that he wrote while in jail. Without her love, understanding, and courage, I would have faltered long ago. I asked about the children. She told me that Yolanda cried when she discovered that her daddy was in jail. Somehow, I have never quite adjusted to bringing my children up under such inexplicable conditions. How do you explain to a little child why do you have to go to jail? Coretta developed an answer. She told them that Daddy has gone to jail to help the people. The rest of the day was spent sleeping, adjusting to the unbearable heat, and talking with other friends. Wyatt, Dr. Anderson, Andy Young, Ted Brown, Vincent Harding, and Addie. King, who floated in. Around 11 o'clock p.m., I fell asleep. Never before have I slept under more miserable conditions. My bed was so hard, my back was so sore, and the jail was so ugly. Wednesday, July 11th. I awoke bright and early. It was around 6 o'clock to be exact. My back was still sore. Around 8 o'clock, breakfast came. We had fasted all day Tuesday in order to prepare ourselves, spiritually, for the ordeals ahead. We broke the fast by eating breakfast. The food is generally good in this jail. This may be due to the fact that the food is cooked, not in the jail itself, but in a cafe adjacent to the jail. For breakfast, we had link sausage, eggs, and grits. I was pleasantly surprised when I discovered that the coffee had cream and sugar. In all the jails that I have inhabited, we were not permitted to have sugar or cream in the coffee. At 10 o'clock, we had a visit from C.K. Steele, Andy Young, and Henry Elkins, my summer assistant pastor. He had brought me some articles that my wife sent from Atlanta. They told us about the mass meeting. It was lively and extremely well attended. They whispered to us that a group was planning to march to the city hall around noon. Around noon, the group did march. They were led by C.K. Steele. All were arrested, about 50. They were first brought to the city jails. We heard them as they approached, singing freedom songs. Naturally, this was a big lift for us. As the group neared the jail, two of the jailers came over and ordered Ralph and I to move over to what is known as the Bullpen. This is a dark and desolate cell that holds 9 persons. It is unbelievable that such a cell could exist in a supposedly civilized society. And so this excerpt that we just read through was all about the experience that Dr. King was having while in the Albany jail. And so I can remember talking to my son, who's fairly young, about me being arrested and me going to jail, and trying to explain to him the reasons that I was inside of jail, and trying to find the right way to articulate things that in a perfect world a child wouldn't even have to contend with. You know, in a perfect world none of us would have to contend with, but especially a child wouldn't have to contend with. And it's something that I still haven't gotten used to. It's still times where different events that have happened, whether it be being arrested and going to jail, which has happened now 10 times, whether it be the shooting that took place a couple of months ago. Every time or even just coming out to City Hall, every time I've had to try to talk to my son and speak to my son about these things has been very difficult. And reading that Dr. King speaking about Coretta talking to his daughter about why he was in jail reminds me of earlier in the book when Dr. King talked about speaking to his mother when she was explaining to him the injustices of segregation, the injustices of racism. And again, this continued generational cycle that black people have to go through of explaining to their children why that the society that they live in is unjust, that the society that they live in will unfairly will treat them unfairly. And so that's one of the things that stands out. But also the description that Dr. King gives of this jail, and my experience inside of Winnebago County Jail is very much similar. The food inside the jail is. He talked about how this was the best food he had in inside of any other jails, but the food inside of jails are horrible. A lot of people talk about how the food inside of prisons are actually better than being inside of jails, and depending on who you talk to, some people who, because of the conditions that county jails have, there's people who believe that there are prisons that the conditions are better in. Anytime I've had food inside of county jail, the hamburger patty ain't real meat. The pancake was like a cornbread, piece of cornbread. None of the food looks anything like any resemblance of food that you eat on the outside world. And I remember when me and Terry were in Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday after a city market, and Terry barely ate throughout the whole thing. I think for the most part, he maybe ate a few times. What up? Ate a few times, if that. But I ate. Whenever they brought food, I ate. It was one of the ways that I marked the days. I would mark the days with my breakfast meal, mark the days with my lunch meal, mark the days with my dinner meal, and that sort of helped me get through the day. I would even leave extra food, any food I couldn't eat, I leave it to the side and eat it later on. And one of the things eating did also was help me to stay tired and to sleep. But one of the side effects of that was when I got out of jail, I would have like a gruesome stomach ache for like the next week. Inside of the jail, after maybe the first full day of eating food, used the bathroom. It was violently using the bathroom. It was horrible. So I can only imagine what it's like for people who are in there for weeks, who are in there for months, and the things that the food does to their body. In there for years. There are people who have been inside this jail for years. And then the same thing, the people who go back and forth inside of this jail, inside of jails, having this type of experience. And those are some of the more subtle things about mass incarceration that does not get talked about, that people don't speak about. And again, the charge that I spent a weekend for and I experienced these things for, I've had that charge dropped now. And so I know that there are people who will say, well, you know, I don't care about the sleeping conditions. Dr. King talked about how bad the sleeping conditions were. I felt the same way. It was freezing. All you get is like one small blanket. The blanket ain't even really a blanket. It's a piece of cloth. You can see through it. It's not thicker than a bath towel. And I was cold the entire time that I was in there. My back and my neck was sore from sleeping inside the cell, inside of there. And again, there are people who have not been found guilty who are dealing with these things. And now it's a separate conversation to even have to say, well, so you've been found guilty of a crime, or these, what's up, you've done something wrong, you're guilty, so I don't care about the sleeping conditions you have, or I don't care about the eating conditions or the drinking conditions or the living conditions you have. But the thing that's important to point out about these jails is that nobody's even been found guilty. So that's a completely separate conversation. These are people who are still waiting for their day in court, who are still innocent by the guise of our laws. And so the fact that they're experiencing these things is completely separate from any crime or any punishment or any trying to rehabilitate these people that one may have if you're speaking about a prison. And I think a lot of times when you haven't dealt with the separations, when you haven't dealt with a jail and then understand the difference between jail and prison, you sort of don't understand those things. When you don't realize that there are people sitting in jail because they don't got $100 or $200 to bond out or to bail out, you don't understand those things. And so the description of the conditions of the jail, to me, is the most poignant piece of this chapter here. And then let's see, where are we at? We're on page 158, 159. Let's see. Let's see where we at. Yeah, let's try to knock out one more page. Let's get one more page knocked out. About 7:30 on the morning of July 13th, we were called and notified that Chief Pritchett wanted to see us. They asked us to dress in our civilian clothes. We did that and went to see Chief Pritchett at about 9 o'clock, at which time the chief said to us that we had been released, in other words, that our fine had been paid. I said, quote, well, Chief, we want to serve this time. We feel that we owe it to ourselves and the 700 and some odd people of this community who still have these cases hanging over them, end quote. His only response then was, quote, God knows, Reverend, I don't want you in my jail, end quote. This was one time that I was out of jail and I was not happy to be out. Not that I particularly enjoyed the inconveniences and the discomforts of jail, but I did not appreciate the subtle and conniving tactics used to get us out of jail. We had witnessed persons being kicked off lunch counter stools during sit-ins, ejected from churches during the kneel-ins, and thrown into jail during the freedom rides. But for the first time, we witnessed being kicked out of jail. And what I want to point out of this is that, and this is the sort of the backwardsness and the hypocrisies of of these corrupt institutions that we're dealing with, is that for example, last year when we were when the city market protest was going on and we were marching on the crosswalk, people were arrested and thrown in jail because the city of Rockford government, because City Market, and because the Rockford Police Department and the Winnebago County State's Attorney said they were not willing to shut the street down for businesses, that they didn't want people disrupting the traffic on the streets. And so if people were going to do that, disrupt the traffic or do anything to cause the street to be shut down, the traffic to be backed up, those people would go to jail. So they arrested 33 people multiple times. You fast forward and we get to 2021, and in an effort to divert the the potency of the protest, to divert the potency of the demonstration, since we had shown a willingness to go to jail for our beliefs, a willingness to go to jail for marching on the crosswalk, a willingness to deal with whatever persecution came with marching on the crosswalk and traffic being backed up and the streets being slowed down. The city decided to shut the streets down themselves, and the police decided to police the street being shut down themselves. And the state's attorney got with the city of Rockford government, and they hatched a plan to protect the closing down of the street because of the potency that we had by marching on the crosswalk. And so the potency that protest and demonstration had was so effective that it made the powers that be have a 180-degree change on their perspective and on their beliefs and on their tactics and their ideology. And you see the same thing happening here, where at once they were imprisoning and jailing Dr. King because of his adamancy to protest and demonstrate, to raise an awareness to these issues. And now that he's shown that militancy and adamancy to stay steadfast, and now that him being in jail has highlighted the hypocrisies and highlighted the issues, they're having a 180-degree change on their tactics and their beliefs, and now they're trying to get him out of the jail. Again, in another effort to subvert the collective voice of the protest, to subvert the collective tactics being used. And so that is one of the ways you can't always tell when you're successful, always based off of policy changing or based off of a law changing. But sometimes you can tell it based off of actions changing or based off of tactics changing. And so that's one of the things I just wanted to point out about that. On July 24th, officials unleashed force against our peaceful demonstration, brutally beating a pregnant woman and caning one of our lawyers. Some of the Negro onlookers, not our demonstrators, seething with resentment, hurled bottles and stones at the police. At that point, I temporarily halted mass demonstrations, and for several days I visited homes, clubs, and pool rooms, urging that no retaliation be tolerated, and even the angriest of men acceded. And then again, I just want to point out in that section there, and then we'll end it here. We get ready to start page 160, so we'll get to page 160 another time as we finish up chapter 16, the Albany movement. But one of the things that you'll often hear is people say protest like how Dr. King protested, or protested how they protested in the 60s, or they'll point to the civil rights struggle as a time where it was only nonviolent protests or nonviolent demonstrations taking place. And I think that one of the things that was the most enlightening for me reading Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s autobiography was how often you will hear him point out how even though the people that may have been a part of the SELC and may have been part of the demonstrators were nonviolent and didn't have any reaction to the violence that was being implemented upon them, there were people who were witnesses and people who were onlookers who did have a reaction to those things happening, who did have a reaction to the violence that these protesters were having dealt upon them. And so there has never, and I say all these things to say that there has never been a time in which protest or mass movement has been completely absolved of violence. And that's because anytime that it is successful, violence is implemented by the institutions that are being protested. Violence is implemented by the organizations or the businesses being protested. And so it's not incumbent upon the protester to be 100% responsible for it being no violence or for things being quote unquote peaceful. It's a 50-50 compromise or 50-50 a 50-50 interaction, sometimes not exactly 50-50, depending on the situation. But it is something that involves two parties. It takes two parties to tango. It takes two people to dance. And so if you go into just the same way as with the crosswalk and with multiple demonstrations that have happened here, the protesters can go into it with the most adamant desire to be nonviolent, but when they are met with violence, when they are attacked and assaulted, that is taken out of their hands. It's taken out of their wheelhouse to be able to be in control of those things. So again, we're reading Autobiography of Martin Luther King Jr. We got through about a chapter and a half there. We're on speaking about the Albany movement, which took place in 1961. Again, as we get deeper and deeper into this book, we get more immersed in the civil rights struggle and some of the ideology and the tactics in the civil rights struggle. And what we want to be doing is taking those the tactics that we're reading about in here that were being implemented and finding out how we can implement those into the struggle to end police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice in 2021 in Winnebago County, with the understanding that you cannot take any revolutionary ideology or any revolutionary tactics or any revolutionary philosophy wholesale and implement it into where you are at currently. But we can take pieces of it. We can find which things can work for here and try to put those things into practice and then learn from putting those things into practice. And so that is what we are doing these Rockford readings for. That's what we are reading the autobiography of Martin Luther King Jr. for. So anybody that's watching this, please share this video. Our main thing is trying to do at least one a day, at least one Rockford reading of this book a day, so that way we can try to get into a place where we're getting into one book a week or one book every 10 days or so. So I'm going to end this live by saying justice for Mikey Guzman, justice for Joseph McCormick, justice for Little Mike Sago, justice for Eddie Patterson, justice for Shannon Graves, justice for Faustin Guaitigo, justice for Suzette Babler, justice for Philip Johnson, justice for Jasper Banks, justice for Logan Bell, justice for Kerry Blake, justice for Demetrius Bennett, justice for Mark Barmore, justice for Jovan Fresco, and justice for Geno Washington. We outside.